The dangerous showdown between the U.S. and Iran in international waters. Defense officials say the U.S. Navy stopped Iran from seizing 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. It's a crucial waterway. Iran apparently at one point fired at one of those tankers.
The entire plan depended on one assumption, that the Americans would not notice. They noticed. It started 3 weeks before anyone publicly admitted a crisis existed. In late winter, commercial satellite imagery flagged unusual activity at Bandar Abbas, Iran's main naval base on the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz. Analysts at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency were cross-referencing imagery from 2 separate passes when they found it. 47 fast attack craft staged in 3 clusters along the eastern breakwater. Not docked the way working boats dock. Staged, bows pointing outward, fuel trucks still alongside. The kind of arrangement that doesn't happen unless someone is planning to move a lot of boats in a very short window. 2 days later, the USS Bataan amphibious ready group transited inbound through the strait on a scheduled rotation. Nothing about that transit was unusual. ARGs move through Hormuz on a rhythm the Iranians have tracked for 20 years. What was unusual is that the Bataan wasn't alone. Running 40 miles astern, below the radar horizon of every coastal station on the Keshem coast, a Virginia-class fast-attack submarine called the USS Hawaii was making 12 knots at 400 feet. Her track was filed as a transit to 5th Fleet. On paper, she was passing through. In practice, she was doing something else entirely. She was listening to a conversation the Iranians were having with each other, and they had no idea anyone was in the room. The IRGC Navy, Iran's Revolutionary Guard maritime force, operates on a doctrine built around what they call the mosaic defense. The idea is that you don't try to match the Americans' platform for platform, because that's a losing game. Instead you swarm. You use speedboats, mines, anti-ship missiles, shore batteries, and drones in simultaneous layered attacks designed to overwhelm point defenses and sink something large enough to make the news. They've wargamed this for 15 years. The Persian Gulf is their bathtub. They know every shallow, every choke point, every blind corner. In their version of events, the mosaic wins. What the mosaic requires, though, is coordination. And coordination requires radio. The Hawaii spent 11 days at 400 feet running a passive intercept collection that her crew would later describe, in the naval equivalent of understatement, as productive. She wasn't transmitting. She wasn't doing anything the Iranians could detect. She was just listening to a communications architecture that the IRGC assumed was secure, writing down frequencies, timing patterns, encryption handshakes, and the call signs of every coastal commander between Bandar Abbas and Abu Musa Island. She was mapping the nervous system of the mosaic before anyone fired a shot. On the 14th day, the Iranians moved. 4 patrol boats came out of Bandar Abbas at 0340, running dark. No AIS transponders, no navigation lights, no radar emissions. They made straight for the commercial traffic lane at the eastern approach to the strait. The same lane 3 laden tankers were transiting southbound toward the Indian Ocean. The lead boat's skipper had a job. He was going to cut across the bow of a Panamanian flag VLCC, get close enough that the master on the tanker had 2 choices, stop or risk collision, and then board for what the IRGC calls a safety inspection. It's not a safety inspection. It's a seizure dressed in paperwork. The tanker's master had made this run 11 times. He knew what a safety inspection looked like. He knew what this looked like. He slowed, because a tanker captain's first obligation is not getting his ship sunk, and he put out a call on Channel 16. The call went to the USS Laboon, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer running escort 6 miles west of the convoy. The Laboon's TAO, Tactical Action Officer, had been watching those 4 boats since they cleared the breakwater. His SBY-1 radar had them painted in the first 30 seconds. He knew their speed, their heading, their precise bearing to the convoy. What he didn't have yet was authority to act. That call from the tanker gave him something to act on. The Laboon turned toward the contact group at 31 knots and lit her and /SBS-73 surface search radar at full power. Not to find the boats. She already had them, but to make sure the boats knew they'd been found. Radar energy hitting your hull and bouncing back has a particular signature. Every Iranian fast attack skipper knows what it means. You've been painted. You are inside a targeting solution. The next step is somebody's decision. At the same time, a Seahawk off the Laboon's fantail dropped from 800 feet to 100 and came in from the east with a searchlight running. 60 million candle power across the water at 0412. 4 Iranian fast attack boats suddenly visible to every ship in the strait, illuminated, broadcast, undeniable. The lead boat slowed. Not immediately. He held course for 90 seconds, which in this context is a very long 90 seconds. On the Laboon's bridge, nobody said much. The gun crew on the Mark 45 forward mount had been at their station since the boats cleared the breakwater. Then the lead boat broke right. The others followed. They ran back toward Bandar Abbas at full speed, which in a Paycap-class boat is roughly 42 knots, and they were back inside the breakwater before sunrise. The tanker resumed its course. The master filed an incident report that took him 40 minutes to write. He'd been through 3 of these. That was the warning. What came after wasn't. 72 hours later, an IRGC mine-laying operation went active in the approaches to Fujairah, on the UAE side of the Omani coast. This is the exit lane, the point where tankers that have already cleared the strait collect themselves before heading into the Arabian Sea. Fujairah is where you go after you've survived Hormuz. Dropping mines, there is a different kind of message. It's not saying we'll block the strait. It's saying we'll block the world. The USS Pioneer, an Avenger-class mine countermeasure ship, was already in theater. Pioneer is the kind of ship the Navy keeps apologizing for and refusing to replace. 34 years old. Wooden fiberglass hull because steel and aluminum create the magnetic signature that mine influence fuses hunt for. Single screw. 12 knots maximum, which means a moderately enthusiastic cargo bike can nearly keep pace. She costs about $45 million. The LCS mine countermeasures package meant to replace her has been in development for 15 years and still doesn't work right. So Pioneer keeps going. Her sonar picked up the first contact at 0612, a Manta-type bottom mine, Iranian-manufactured, roughly 450 pounds of high explosive sitting in 9 meters of water on the sand. A Manta doesn't have a tether. It sits on the bottom and waits, listening for the acoustic and magnetic signature of a large ship overhead, and then it decides whether today is the day. Think of it as a pressure sensor bolted to a bomb that has all the patience in the world and no sense of proportion. Pioneer logged it, marked the coordinates, and kept moving. The captain had a grid to clear, and the mine wasn't going anywhere. The second contact was different. 30 meters down, on a tether, acoustic influence fuse, Mahan type. When Pioneer's sonar painted it, the contact geometry didn't resolve cleanly. The return was partially obscured by a silt shelf that had built up over the mine's anchor chain. The sonar operator called it a probable contact and flagged it for the Seafox. The Seafox is a German-built expendable mine disposal vehicle. It's about the size of a large torpedo, fiber optic tethered, with a camera on the nose and a shaped charge in the head. You drive it down to the mine, you confirm visual identification on the camera feed, and then you detonate the charge against the mine's casing and it handles itself. It costs around $80,000. The mine it neutralizes costs Iran somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 to manufacture and deploy. The math is annoying, but the math is better than the alternative, which is a tanker taking the mine instead. The Seafox operator took 14 minutes to work the contact. The silt shelf kept occluding the camera view. On the third pass, he got a clean angle and confirmed the Mahan's fuse housing. He pushed the Seafox against the casing and keyed the detonator. The pressure wave rolled up through Pioneer's hull like someone had dropped a large piece of furniture on the deck from the outside. The crew barely reacted. This was the third one this week. What none of the Pioneer's crew could see from their position inside the mine lane was what was happening 8 miles north, on the surface and at altitude. The EA-18G Growler, the aircraft the Iranians had been misreading as a P-8 Poseidon on a routine collection run, had been working the electromagnetic environment over the northern Gulf for 6 hours. An EA-18G Growler is a 2-seat, carrier-based electronic warfare aircraft. It looks enough like a standard Hornet that at long range, casual identification misses it. The Iranians had been cataloging it as a standard ISR platform running a milk run. They weren't wrong that it was collecting. They were wrong about what it was collecting and what it intended to do with it. The YLQ-99 jamming pods hanging off the Growler's wing stations hadn't been powered yet. The crew was still in collection mode, passive, quiet, accumulating. The weapons systems officer in the backseat had been building a signal library since wheels up. Every Iranian coastal radar on the northern approach, every fire control emitter, every encrypted voice network handoff between the IRGC Navy and the Coastal Defense Command. She had call signs, frequencies, waveforms, and timing patterns. She had enough to walk into their network and have a conversation, if it came to that. At 0843, it came to that. An Iranian Noor anti-ship missile battery on Abu Musa Island went to fire control radar. The Noor is Iran's domestically produced derivative of the Chinese C-802, a subsonic sea skimmer with a 360-pound warhead and enough range to reach anything in the Eastern Gulf. Going to fire control radar means you have a target in mind. You have a firing solution. You are one authorization code away from a launch. The battery had been tracking Pioneer for 2 hours. The fire control radar coming up was either a very serious provocation or the beginning of something worse, and the difference between those two things closes very quickly once a missile leaves the rail. On the Growler, the threat warning system lit up the moment the fire control radar went active. The weapons systems officer didn't wait for an order. She pulled the LQ-99 pods live and hit the Iranian fire control radar with a focused jamming beam that saturated the frequency in under 2 seconds. the radar's return feed turned to noise. The operator on Abu Musa was suddenly staring at a screen that looked like someone had poured static into it. That bought seconds. Seconds matter when a missile battery is deciding whether to fire on a degraded solution. What the Growler did next is harder to explain without getting into electronic warfare doctrine that the Navy doesn't publish, but the short version is this. Using the frequencies and waveforms she'd been collecting all morning, the weapons systems officer pushed a signal into the IRGC Coastal Defense Command network that looked to every automated system on that network like an order from Bandar Abbas command to go to emission silence. Stand down. Shut off. It wasn't an order from Bandar Abbas. It was the Growler talking to Iran's own network in Iran's own language, on Iran's own frequencies, with authentication patterns she'd spent 6 hours collecting. The Abu Musa battery went dark. So did 3 other coastal stations that received the same broadcast simultaneously. There's a concept in electronic warfare called cognitive jamming. You don't just overwhelm the radar, you convince the operator that his own system has issued him an instruction. It's not just interference. It's impersonation. It works because network defense systems are built on the assumption that the network itself is secure. Once that assumption fails, the network's own architecture becomes the attack surface. It took the IRGC Coastal Defense commander 11 minutes to realize what had happened. By that time, his network was back online and his operators were screaming at him about gaps in the timeline they couldn't account for. He ordered a full emissions check across every station from Keshem to Abu Musa. What he found was that his network had issued orders he hadn't sent, and that something had been inside his communications architecture long enough to know exactly what those orders needed to sound like. That was a different kind of problem than a jammed radar. Pioneer kept working. By 11:30, her crew had logged 19 contacts and neutralized 11 confirmed mines. The other 8 were marked as probable contacts requiring follow-up by end-of-day divers from the USS Michael Murphy, which had come up from the south with a rigid-hull inflatable carrying 4 explosive ordnance disposal specialists who had exactly the kind of professional calm that either comes from extensive training or a willingness to accept outcomes that most people prefer not to think about. The dive team went into the water at 12:04. The visibility at depth was 3 meters in the good sections and 0 in the silt pockets. The first diver found the contact he was looking for at 22 feet, a manta, partially buried, fuse housing exposed. He confirmed it by feel as much as sight, attached the demolition charge, set the timer for 8 minutes, and swam back toward the RIB at a pace that was efficient but not panicked. There's a version of this job where you hurry. He'd learned early that the version of this job where you hurry produces outcomes you can't walk away from. The charge went at 12:19. The pressure column broke the surface 15 meters behind the RIB. The diver was already lighting a cigarette, which the Navy officially discourages and unofficially treats as a job hazard of a very specific kind. At 13:40, the Laboon picked up a new contact group leaving Bandar Abbas. Not fast attack boats this time. 3 Hodong-class missile boats, bigger, heavier, carrying C-802 anti-ship missiles of their own. They were making 28 knots on a course that split the difference between the Pioneer operating area and the main traffic lane. Not heading directly at anything. Just there. Present. Demonstrating intent without crossing the line that turns intent into an act of war. The Bataan ARG had a Marine Expeditionary Unit aboard. The Bataan herself was 40 miles south. Her air wing was up. 2 F-35Bs were already airborne on a combat air patrol that happened to be positioned between the Hodong group and the Pioneer operating area, which was not a coincidence. The Hodong skipper knew what an F-35B looked like at 2 miles. He also knew that his 3 boats and their missiles represented a credible threat in a permissive environment. This was not a permissive environment. He had a Growler somewhere overhead that had already demonstrated it could walk inside his command network without knocking. He had a destroyer with a full VLS magazine. He had 2 stealth fighters at low altitude who could put a JDAM through his bridge before his targeting radar completed a single rotation. He held the course for 20 minutes. Then he altered right and began a wide arc back toward Bandar Abbas. Back in the mine lane, Pioneer's captain was making a different kind of calculation. The Fujairah approaches were clearing, but not fast enough. The tanker queue waiting on the other side of the clearance operation had grown to 16 ships over 3 weeks of sporadic Iranian mining. A Korean LNG carrier, 4 VLCCs, a container ship out of Singapore. The commercial traffic was starting to route around, down the east coast of Oman, around the Horn of Africa, adding 12 to 15 days of transit time and somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million per voyage in fuel and time costs. Multiplied across 16 ships, multiplied across 3 weeks, the mine campaign was working economically even without sinking anything. The captain knew this. The IRGC knew this. The mine wasn't a weapon designed to kill ships. It was a weapon designed to make shipping expensive enough that someone in a boardroom in Seoul or Rotterdam would pick up a phone and call their government representative and say, quietly but clearly, that whatever was happening in the Gulf needed to stop costing money. At 1512, Pioneer's sonar painted a contact that made the captain go quiet for a moment. The contact was in grid square 22 Alpha, an area that had been cleared and certified clean at 0800 that morning. 8 hours earlier, his sonar had walked every inch of that grid. Nothing. Now there was something. He keyed the intercom and asked his sonar operator to rerun the contact classification. The operator came back in 40 seconds. Probable manta type. Resting on the bottom. Not buried. Recently placed. Iran was receding the cleared lane. While Pioneer worked the forward grid, small craft, wooden fishing dhows with no radar signature, no transponder, no weapons visible on deck, were running mines back into the areas already cleared. The task group couldn't clear and hold simultaneously. They didn't have the platforms. Clearing takes Pioneer and multiple helicopter assets and EOD teams and 8 to 10 hours per grid square. Holding would take a continuous surface presence the 5th Fleet couldn't sustain. The captain stared at the contact return for a long moment. Then he picked up the handset and called the Laboon. There was one option. Get the tankers moving now, through the cleared corridor, before the corridor stopped being cleared. Once commercial traffic was transiting, the receding operation became dramatically more complicated. You couldn't drop mines in a lane with a supertanker in it and expect them to wait for military targets. You'd just mine your own mining operation. At 1604, the Laboon broadcast the cleared lane coordinates on the International Maritime Safety Frequency. Every tanker master in the Eastern Gulf received the waypoints within 90 seconds. The first ship to move was the Korean LNG carrier, a 330-meter double hull, 150,000 cubic meters of liquefied natural gas under pressure, running at 14 knots under a master who had been waiting for 3 weeks and had not slept more than 4 hours in any of the last 72. He brought her into the western approach at 1618 and pointed her bow at the first waypoint. Pioneer fell in 3 miles ahead of her. The Seahawk from the Laboon flew the cleared lane at low altitude, searchlight active, doing one last visual sweep. The EOD rib from the Michael Murphy ran the shallow edge where the sonar coverage was thinnest. The Korean carrier transited in 2 hours and 40 minutes. She never slowed below 13 knots. Her master didn't sleep until she was 50 miles into the Arabian Sea. 6 more ships followed her in the next 4 hours. By 0200, 9 vessels had made the transit. The commercial shipping industry, which has an extremely efficient mechanism for sharing information that saves money and avoids catastrophe, had the route coordinates on every major tanker message board within the hour. Ships that had been sitting at anchor for 3 weeks began moving. The IRGC had one more move. At 0310, a drone, a Shahid 136 or something built along the same lines, came off the Abu Musa coast at low altitude. The Shahid 136 is a loitering munition. It's delta-winged, propeller-driven, cheap enough to produce at scale, and built around the idea that a weapon costing $20,000 can do damage worth $50 million if it finds the right target. Iran had used them in Yemen, in Ukraine indirectly through transfers, and now apparently here. It came in at 50 feet above the water, following the topography of the wave surface, below the coverage floor of most surface search radars. It didn't get far. The Batan's air wing had an MV-22 Osprey running a late logistics run that happened to be flying the eastern approach at medium altitude, and the Osprey's crew spotted the drone's heat signature through their FLIR at 2 miles. They called it on guard frequency. The Laboon's close-in weapons system, the Phalanx, a radar-guided Gatling gun that fires 4,500 rounds per minute of tungsten penetrators, acquired the contact at 600 meters. The engagement lasted 1.4 seconds. The drone disintegrated 230 meters off the Laboon's port bow. Somewhere on Abu Musa, someone sent a text message that the American electronic surveillance teams would spend the next several hours translating and analyzing. The message, rendered into English, said something roughly equivalent to, "It didn't work. The mine campaign didn't work either." Not ultimately. It raised shipping insurance rates and rerouted 40 vessels and cost the global economy something the analysts are still calculating, and it demonstrated clearly that Iran could disrupt Hormuz traffic with small, cheap, difficult-to-attribute tools. But it did not close the strait. The corridor was open. The tankers moved. Pioneer's captain brought the Avenger out of the lane at 2240 and anchored in the Omani territorial water, 4 miles from the last contact grid. His crew had been working for 19 hours. His sonar operator had classified over 60 contacts. His Seafox team had run 11 vehicles. He'd consumed 40% of his expendable magazine in a single week. There are 6 Avenger-class ships left in the United States Navy. There used to be 14. The Navy has been trying to divest the class for a decade and replace it with a mine countermeasures capability that works from an LCS and can be deployed by helicopter. That capability remains, as of this writing, not ready. So Pioneer remains, as of this writing, indispensable, not because she is modern, not because she is fast, not because anyone designed her for a 21st century minefield, but because she is there, and she is crewed by people who will spend 19 hours in a wooden boat inside the engagement envelope of an Iranian coastal missile battery, doing a job that nobody has figured out how to do any other way. On the bridge, the captain made a note in his log that the cleared corridor coordinates had been successfully broadcast and that transit operations were proceeding as of 1604. He noted the drone intercept. He noted the receding attempt and the decision to expedite tanker transit. Then he noted that grid square 22 Alpha still had a contact on it that EOD hadn't reached. He'd get to it in the morning. 40 miles south, the LNG carrier was making 17 knots through dark water, navigation lights burning, AIS transponder on, the master on the bridge drinking his third coffee of the night. He had a phone call scheduled with his company's operations center in Seoul at 0600. They were going to ask him how the transit went. He was going to say, fine. It was fine. Behind him, in the cleared lane he had just crossed, a wooden dhow turned on its engine somewhere north of Abu Musa and began heading toward the water that Pioneer would be working again at first light.